Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are here with Tuesday's video. More eats, shoots, and leaves. So, yeah, like I said, this is meant to be Tuesdays. I've been behind, as I typically am. But anyway, with that said, let's go ahead and jump into this. The big final rule for the comma is one that you won't find in any books by grammarians. It is quite easy to remember, however. The rule is don't use commas like a stupid person. I mean it. More than any other mark, the comma requires the writer to use intelligent discretion and be simply alert in potential ambiguity. For example, Lenora walked on her head, a little higher than usual. 2. The driver managed to escape the vehicle before it sank and swam to the riverbank. 3. Don't guess, use a timer or watch. 4. The convict said the judge is mad. In the first example, of course, the comma has been misplaced or belongs after on. The second example suggests that the vehicle swam to the riverbank rather than the passenger. It requires a comma after sank. The third is pretty interesting since it actually conveys the opposite of its intended meaning. What it appears to say is, don't guess or use a timer or a watch, when in fact it only wants you not to guess. If it therefore requires a semicolon or even a full stop after guess rather than a comma. The fourth makes perfect sense, of course, unless what's intended is the convict, said the judge, is mad. Two particular stupid uses of the comma are proliferating and need to be noted. One is the comma memorably described in this English column of the New Statesman in the late 1970s as the Yobs comma. The Yobs comma, of course, has no syntactical value. It is the equivalent of a fuddled gasp for breath as the poor writer marshals his battered thoughts. Examples cited in the New Statesman included this from The Guardian. The society decided not to prosecute the owners of the Windsor Safari Park, where animals have allegedly been fed live to snakes and lions on legal advice. The comma after animals is not only ungrammatical and intrusive, but throws the end of the sentence on legal advice into complete semantic chaos. Meanwhile, moronic sentences such as parents are being urged to take advice of a scheme designed to prevent children getting lost in supermarkets. And what was different back then was if you had disagreed with the wrong group, you could end up with no head, are observably on the increase. Less stoppable is the drift towards American telegraphies in news headlines, where the comma is increasingly given the job of replacing the word and. Thus, UK study spurns Al Qaeda Iraq link. Mother, 3 sons die in farm fire. So that's nearly it for the comma. Although it is not true that the legal profession has historically eschewed commas altogether, one begins to realize that there is a sensible reason for its traditional wariness. It is sometimes said, for instance, that Sir Roger Casement, the Irish would-be insurrectionist, was actually hanged on a comma, which you have to admit sounds like a bit of a very rough justice, though jolly intriguing. How do you get hanged on a comma exactly? Does the trope keep slipping off? Or does the rope keep slipping off? Well, having landed in Ireland in 1916 from a German submarine, Casement was arrested and charged under the Treason Act of 1351, whereupon his defense counsel opted to argue a point of punctuation, which is the last refuge of the scoundrel, of course. But never mind, you can't blame the chap. It must have seemed worth a go. His point was that the Treason Act was not only written in Norman French, but was unpunctuated and was thus open to interpretation. The contested words in question, translated literally, were, "If a man be adherent to the king's enemies in his realm, giving to them aid and comfort in the realm or elsewhere." Casement's defense argued that, since Casement had not been adherent to the king's enemies in the realm, indeed, on the contrary, had scrupulously conducted all his treasonous plotting abroad, he was not guilty. Now, I guarantee you can look at this set of words for hours at a stretch without seeing any virtue in this pathetic contention. Casement was clearly condemned by the phrase, "or elsewhere," regardless of how you punctuate it. However, 2 judges duly traipsed off to the Public Record Office to examine the original statute and discovered under a microscope a faint but helpful virgule after the second realm, which apparently, don't ask, cleared up the whole thing. Mr. Justice Darling ruled that giving aid and comfort to the king's enemies were words of apposition. They are words to explain what is meant by being adherent to, and we think that if a man be adherent to the king's enemies elsewhere, he is equally adherent to the king's enemies, and if he is adherent to the king's enemies, then he will commit the treason which the statute of Edward III defines. How this story ever got the sensational name "Hanged on a Comma," however, is an interesting matter. "Tried to get off on a comma" is a more accurate representation of the truth. A similar comma dispute still rages today in a case with less explosive overtones. On his deathbed in April of 1991, Graham Greene corrected and signed a typed document which restricts access to his papers at Georgetown University. Or does it? The document, before correction, stated, "I, Graham Greene, grant permission to Norman Sherry, my authorized autobiographer, excluding any other, to quote from my copyright material, published or unpublished. Being a chap who had correctly proofs all his life, Green automatically added a comma after excluding any other and died the next day without explaining that he had intended by it. And a great ambiguity was thereby created. Are all other researchers excluded from quoting the material, or only other biographers? The librarian at Georgetown interprets the document to mean that nobody besides Norman Sherry can consult the material at all. Meanwhile, others, including Green's son, argue that the comma was carefully inserted by Green only to indicate that Sherry was the sole authorized biographer. It is worth pointing out here, by the way, that legal English, with its highfalutin efforts to cover everything, nearly always ends up leaving itself semantically wide open like this, and that if Green had been allowed to write either "let Norman Sherry see the stuff and no one else," or "don't let other biographers quote from it, but otherwise all are welcome," none of this ridiculous palaver would have transpired. But yeah, that ends the chapter, which means in the next episode we'll be starting chapter 3. But yeah, let's go back over some of the stuff here. I especially love in the beginning. They have 1. Lenora walked on her head, a little higher than usual. When it's supposed to be, Lenora walked on, her head a little higher than usual. And 2 was, the driver managed to escape from the vehicle before it sank and swam to the riverbank. When it was supposed to be, the driver managed to escape from the vehicle before it sank and swam to the riverbank. And 3 is, don't guess, use a timer or watch. Which, like I said, needed a semicolon or a period. Just don't guess. Use a timer or watch. The convict said the judge is mad. Like they said, it's supposed to be the convict said the judge is mad. So instead of being the convict saying the judge is mad, it's the judge saying the convict is mad. So yeah. And then they talk about the Yob's comma. The society decided not to prosecute the owners of Windsor Safari Park, where animals have allegedly been fed live to snakes and lions on legal advice. It's like, you can do with less of these by just saying, the society decided not to prosecute the owners of Windsor Safari Park, where animals have been allegedly fed live to snakes and lions, comma, on legal advice. But yeah, and then they talk about the tendency of American headlines and news to replace the "and" with a comma. UK study spurns Al Qaeda, comma, Iraq link. You'll see stuff like that all the time, instead of just UK study spurns Al Qaeda and Iraq link, or mother, comma, 3 sons die in a farm fire, instead of mother and 3 sons die in a farm fire. And then she talks about William Casement and some odd uses of the comma. But yeah, that ends that chapter. And like I said, next episode we'll be starting the next chapter, which is Airs and Graces. But we'll go ahead and end there. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.